Narcissistic people think of themselves as good, which they're called the self-blame inversion. Hey everyone, it's Dr. Ramani. Welcome back to this YouTube channel on narcissism and narcissistic relationships and healing from narcissistic relationships. So let's talk about something I'm calling the self-blame inversion. In essence, that narcissistic people actually think of themselves as being really good people. After I talk about the self-blame inversion in this video, I'm also going to talk about 5 ways that self-blame shows up in a narcissistic relationship to really bring that point home. People in narcissistic relationships blame themselves. It's what you do, right? If it's your fault, then you can fix it. You can change it. And then you can keep the relationship going, maintain the status quo. Blaming yourself is part of the larger system of justification that people go through in these relationships. Things like, oh, I'm being too demanding, I'm asking too much of them, they don't mean it, they had a tough day, that kind of thing. So as you know, this month I'm talking about some concepts that I share in my new book, It's Not You. And self-blame is a core aspect of the fallout of narcissistic abuse, which takes us to chapter 3. People in narcissistic relationships often think that they're the bad one, that maybe you're the one who's doing something wrong. Maybe you are a bad person for even thinking that this person is narcissistic, especially if you think you're supposed to think of them as a nice person. But at the same time, the narcissistic person, believe it or not, thinks that they're a good, even a great person. This is actually one of the great mind F's of the narcissistic relationship. They genuinely think that they are nice people. They may describe themselves as empathic, generous, as a good person. They will say that, I'm a good person. And at least most of the way down, they really believe it. When they say that, I don't even think we can really quite call it gaslighting, even though it is, frankly, an alteration of reality. At some level, it even feels like a delusion. But it can also leave you feeling hopeless and helpless, because it's one thing if the narcissistic person's walking around and thinking like, I'm not a very nice person, no wonder she's mad at me, or, ugh, I'm a rotten person, but deal with it because I'm rotten. But that's not what they believe. To maintain their perfectionistic exterior and get supply, part of that unprocessed process for them is that they think of themselves as great, good, nice, cool, helpful. Every so often, you may find the narcissistic person who will say, yeah, I know I'm an a-hole. That's how I get deals closed. That's how I get things done. But that's often posturing. That sort of, aren't I so cool, I'm so successful because I'm a badass sort of thing. But if you were to dig a little deeper, you will find that they probably think they're a nice person. Now, obviously, the interesting thing about narcissism is like a complicated layer cake. If you were to go all the way into their deepest core, they feel terrible, but they aren't in touch with that sense of terribleness that they have all these defenses against. Because people in narcissistic relationships blame themselves, and at the same time, the narcissistic people are firmly convinced that they are good people, this can really cement the self-blame dynamic. Remember, self-blame is a sort of attachment response. If it's your fault, then there's something to be done. The other person, who you often feel you need, isn't bad, and then you can maintain the relationship by doing things to yourself, by fixing yourself. Obviously, for a child, the opposite of that would be catastrophic, to believe that their parent is bad and that they have knowing that they have nowhere else to turn. And so we start a long-term process of accommodating and modifying ourselves in 1,000 different ways so we can maintain the relationship and the illusion that someday the narcissistic person will change or the relationship will get better. Since we know self-blame is such a characteristic part of the fallout of narcissistic abuse, just to have a summary and a review, let's take a look at 5 ways that self-blame shows up in your behavior in a narcissistic relationship. Number 1, constant apologizing, and I mean constant. And this behavior generalizes, you know what I mean. You say things like sorry when all you do is walk through a door. You say sorry for eating. You apologize constantly for just your mere existence, and not just with the narcissistic person. It starts to show up everywhere. It makes sense. It's part of the cycle of appeasing the narcissist. But every time we apologize, we are basically acknowledging that we did something wrong when we didn't. And in time, it becomes a sort of indoctrinated pattern in these relationships because they are also always shifting blame onto us. But if we apologize, and when we apologize, we're basically saying, I did something bad. That's why I'm saying I'm sorry. And over time, internally, we psychologically shift to believe that, and before long, we think of ourselves as bad people. Number 2 sign of self-blame is walking on eggshells and chronic appeasing. This builds on that first point I made, but it's a sort of constant hypervigilance people have in these relationships. As a narcissistic relationship proceeds, you become more and more careful about what you say and what you do, because sometimes saying good things gets you in trouble. Sometimes saying bad things gets you in trouble, and after a while, you just don't know what sets the narcissistic person off. So you waste time choosing every word with absolute ridiculous precision. And so when they get angry, you may blame yourself for not being careful enough on those eggshells, rather than the simple fact that their behavior, their inflexibility, is completely unacceptable. Number 3 is when you take the blame for things that are not your fault, or simply just blame yourself for things that are not your fault. Now, narcissistic folks will not take responsibility or be accountable. They just want. Well, so we often do. And that is obviously linked to how self-blame develops and how it shows up for us. It's an interesting issue. Because when something goes wrong in life, there's always this sense that someone has to be responsible for it. And since A, they won't take responsibility, and B, will gaslight you and tell you that you're responsible or that it's your fault, taking the blame is a common way that survivors experience these relationships. Number 4 is over-preparation and doing everything. This is an interesting sort of sign of self-blame, or it's also an interesting sort of process, because people in narcissistic relationships are often called out as being control freaks. Has that ever happened to you? Have you ever been called the control freak in the relationship, despite the narcissistic person being so controlling? But this actually may be more about the self-blame and management of the relationship. In narcissistic relationships, you may recall that you got 100 details right. For example, you're doing something like planning a family vacation or a big project at work. The narcissistic person will do very little, but they'll have no problem weighing in with all kinds of suggestions. They actually do nothing, and then they critique you for what you did or didn't do, or rage at you for what you forgot. They didn't notice the 100 things you did, by the way. So this can result in a correction in this can result in a correction in people who are in narcissistic relationships. And you just keep trying to get it righter and righter. You pack for every contingency that could go wrong on the trip and still try to fit it all into a carry-on bag because they won't check the bags. You overthink the details. So much of this relates to the idea that it's always your fault when things go wrong. So by trying to overdo, over-prepare, try to manage every little detail, you try to get it perfect so you don't have to either literally incur the wrath of the narcissistic person or hear their internalized voice, even if they're out of your life. Oh, you got it wrong again. All of this can mean that you spend far more time doing stuff than you need to, or with more detail than anybody else. Number 5 sign of self-blame is mind reading. The idea that you actually believe you need to or can read someone else's mind to anticipate their needs. It's absolutely ridiculous, and yet it's how most people in narcissistic relationships have to function. The narcissistic person is entitled enough to believe that you should have known what they were thinking and genuinely anticipated what they wanted or needed, and even how they wanted you to respond. So you may genuinely think you can do those things. And so when things go wrong, instead of recognizing that they're being unreasonable, and also that it is impossible to read another person's mind, that an adult is responsible for communicating what they need, You may fall into a cycle of, damn it, I should have known that. I should have expected that. In some cases, survivors may even feel as though they were selfish for not being able to mind read. The blame shifting and unrealistic expectations of the narcissistic relationship and the tendency for survivors to blame themselves can result in this unrealistic expectation that if we could just figure out what they want, everything would be fine. I have more patterns included in this book, so please go check it out and learn about the rest of them, because they may be part of how you have responded to the relationship. There is a beautiful moment in healing from these relationships where you start to blame yourself less, when the radical acceptance really kicks in. And yes, it is a beautiful moment, because once that part of the cycle starts to slowly stop, the trauma bond will slowly disintegrate. When it comes to thinking about self-blame, and every time you keep wondering, was this my fault? Is it me? Remember, it's not you.